Hi everyone, welcome to class. Today we will be talking about creating the illusion of dimension with light and shadow. Last week we learned about how to render a range of values with a pencil. Those techniques are going to come in handy today, so make sure you watch that episode if you haven't already. So why are we learning about lighting? Light is the reason we can see things, and the combination of light and shadow is what helps our eyes perceive depth. That's one of the reasons why understanding lighting is so important in the world of art. Lighting is a complex subject and can get really complicated really quickly. So today, I'll be teaching a slightly simplified lesson on examining the basic elements of light and dark. Then, we'll try creating a dimensional drawing using those elements, as well as the drawing techniques that we have been learning over the past few weeks. The most important part of this lesson will be to observe. The more we observe, the better we can imitate, and the better we can imitate, the more convincing our own artwork can become. So, let's get started. For today's lesson, you will need a printout of this episode's worksheet, a regular pencil, and an eraser. For the first part of our lesson, we're going to start with our worksheet, which has empty space for you to write down important words and their definitions. This will be a handy reference, so I encourage you to take good notes. In the top portion of the worksheet is a ball. It's lit on one side and dark on the other. First, let's talk about light. Imagine that there is a light shining above this ball. The area on the ball that is lit by that light is called the direct light. The small, bright white spot is called the highlight. It's the brightest part of the direct light. But be aware that not all objects have distinct highlights. In between the direct light and the shadow is a gradient called the halftone. It's the transition area between light and shadow and is only partially lit by the light source. Now let's talk about shadow. There are two types of shadows, form shadows and cast shadows. A form shadow is the shadow that appears on the object itself in the areas that turn away from the light source. The area on the object that receives the least amount of light and is therefore the darkest form shadow is called the core shadow. A cast shadow is the shadow that an object casts on another surface when it blocks the light source. Most people would assume that the farthest point away from a light source would be the darkest point on an object, but light tends to bounce around and indirectly affect shadow areas. When a shadow is affected by bouncing light, we refer to this as reflected light. This isn't the same as having a second light source because reflected light can occur from a single light source. Most objects we encounter have both a form shadow and a cast shadow, and both can be affected by reflected light. So now that you have all these terms written down, let's see how these elements of light and shadow work together in real life by observing how lighting affects a white ball. In normal life, we very rarely will encounter this sort of dramatic lighting, which means that the concepts we covered might not be so evident in our everyday environments. But we use this kind of controlled environment to better study how light works and to observe its properties without complication. One thing that you'll realize is that the appearance of light and shadow changes depending on where we're positioned relative to the ball and the light source. This is why observation is so important for us to be able to convey believable light and shadow in our artwork. The lighting for a cube might not seem as straightforward, since light doesn't curve around the flat planes the same way that it curves around a ball. But the cube should still have some combination of the elements of light and shadow. It just depends on the angle of the light and the cube's position. Now that we're more familiar with the different elements of light and shadow, let's try applying all the concepts covered today and in the past few weeks in a drawing exercise. On the bottom half of the worksheet, recreate this image as accurately as you can. We've included this image as a downloadable file in your lesson. I'll walk you through the drawing and rendering process step by step so you can follow along. The image will show up on the screen as I draw, but I encourage you to download the file and access the image on another screen if you can, so that you can see the details more clearly. The goal of this exercise is threefold: to observe the reference, apply the concepts of light and shadow, and use the rendering techniques we learned in order to create the illusion of dimension. It might be a little tricky to balance all these different concepts in one drawing. The best thing to do is work slowly and patiently and gradually work your way from light to dark. Start by drawing a medium-sized circle using your whole arm, as we talked about in episode 2. It will be hard to squeeze all the light and shadow elements onto a small circle, so make sure it's a good size. Clean up your lines with an eraser. It's important to have a precise drawing before you start shading. If you realize later that you don't like something, it'll be really difficult to go backwards to change the shape of your circle after you've already started rendering it. You can also lightly draw the outline of the cast shadow. The shadow isn't completely round because the ball is sitting on fabric that isn't laying perfectly flat. Draw what you see and not what you assume. When your drawing looks good, you can start shading your circle smoothly and evenly. Notice on the reference that even though we're looking at a white ball, only the highlight is pure white, and the rest of the direct light area is slightly darker. So leave the highlight area blank, and let's give the rest of the circle a light layer of gray. You can make it a little darker in the shadow areas. We're basically applying the same steps that we used to render the gradient last week by combining layers and pressure to get the different values in our drawing. Add another light layer to the shadow areas and gradually add more pressure to darken them. Remember, we want to build up the shadows slowly and gradually because it's easier to darken than it is to lighten. Notice also that I'm not going back to render the direct light area. I'm not going to add any more layers except to make a smooth halftone because it's already at the value that I want and I don't want it to get any darker. Continue adding layers and control the pressure as you keep working. Observe the subtleties. Because light from the light source bounces around and affects different parts of the ball, the shadow areas are not all just one value. In our reference, the cast shadow is darker than the core shadow. The core shadow is darker than the reflective light, and the reflective light is darker than the direct light. So each shadow area in your drawing needs a different amount of pressure to be conveyed convincingly. As you get closer to finishing, be careful not to overshade. When an area gets dark enough, you can leave it alone and just continue to render the areas that need it. Reserve the most pressure for the darkest darks at the end. By the end, you might feel like you're losing steam. Stay focused and don't go into autopilot. Take another good look at your reference and see if there's any subtle details you can add to your drawing. Touch up any areas that need it. On the other hand, if you're totally in the zone or want an additional challenge, I encourage you to try shading the background. The background is dark, so we'll start rendering with more pressure right off the bat, but we should still use more than one layer and reserve the most pressure for the end. Adjust the direction of your lines to follow the round shape of the ball. Shade evenly, since stray marks can still show through multiple layers. Add another dark but even layer using more pressure than before. You can add as many layers as you need. It'll be really tricky to erase at this point, since you would have to remove multiple layers of rendering to fix one small mistake. So be careful all the way to the end. As the background gets darker, it will give more context to your drawing and add to the illusion of depth and dimension. If you observed carefully, rendered patiently, and matched the values accurately, your drawing should look pretty dimensional right now. For the past few lessons, we've been slowly progressing from basic to complex, starting with line, then moving on to tone, and now finally addressing the illusion of dimensionality through light and shadow. You might have been feeling anxious to learn more impressive techniques in order to feel like you're truly growing as an artist. Maybe even now you want to jump to color or to painting or portraits. But I'd like to remind you that building a solid foundation with patience allows for greater potential. This simple drawing exercise is a perfect example of that. In life, we're not usually going to be encountering perfectly white, smooth shapes lit up by a spotlight with a simplified background. This setup is so simple and idealized. We might want to draw more complex setups or more interesting subject matter instead. We might be intrigued by multiple light sources, various textures and temperatures, and other variables to make our drawings more impressive. Yet this is the perfect setup to build your foundation by stripping down a vastly complex subject into terms and elements that you can easily observe, practice, and apply to your own artwork. If you're faithful in taking these lessons and practicing what you've learned with patience and diligence, you're more likely to see real lasting growth than if you were to skip ahead to more exciting things without deep understanding of the basic principles. This is because mastering the small, seemingly insignificant things gives you the ability to master the greater things when they come around. These simple concepts are at work all around you, so keep observing and keep practicing, and we'll see you in the next class.